right, this is Kendra with Twist TV, and we're back, and I'm back with another video. Now, I'm not talking about Muslims. I was on a topic on this man's channel, and I was honestly discussing the Hebrew Israelites. And so this is for educational purposes only, that we're watching this. You could go check out this man's channel if you decide to. But I wanted to discuss just the Hebrew Israelites. Now, I read a couple of books, and I like to follow a lot of Camario Ahu's, like his channel and stuff like that, because he has a lot of good information and insight. And I actually started getting some of the books that he referred to us as sources. But one of the books that I did get was discussing the Israelites. Now, I did do a small video just having pictures of the Israelites and how they looked, and just understanding the Spanish Inquisition and many books that were read about the Hebrews who were exiled from Portugal and Spain and shipped to, keyword there is to, Africa. And these Hebrew Israelites were forced out of Portugal and Spain and into Africa as servants due to them practicing the Hebrew religion. And so, anyway, they were shipped into Africa and then exiled out of Africa by royal decree of King George, because they were still practicing the Hebrew religion. And some of them, if they, left maybe before, if they had enough wealth or money or ability, left a little bit before the decree, even out of Africa, these Portuguese and Spanish exiles, and came to the New World either as servants of the Queen or the King of Spain and Portugal, or as servants and slaves who were exiled out of Portugal and Spain, and many of them came into the Americas as Sephardic Jews and so forth and so on. And so these people were described as a brown-skinned people, right? And I'm going to say this. Remember in the Bible where it literally says that Japhet will dwell in the tents of Shem. To understand that in a lot of places that Shem, Shem, the Hebrew bloodline, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were in many, Japhet was in many areas and lived amongst Shem at some periods of time. Now, I wanted to discuss he's going to ask this man, is this man a Hebrew? He is. Now, we got to understand that the descendants of the Israelites, right? We have to understand and take in consideration that being a Hebrew is not a white or black thing, because those are social constructs created through, at one point, a caste system, which one meant wealth, white, one meant poor, black, right? It had nothing to do with hue of complexion. And we have to also take into consideration nationality. When you say that Jesus Christ is a white man, what are white people? What are white people's nationality? Where do they belong? Where did they come from? What are their origins? If you're saying black people in America, you have to say, well, if they're black, well, what nations do they belong to? Where did they come from? Where's their origin? And so I read certain books like Zondervan Pictorial Dictionary, where it clearly states in Zondervan that Ham is the progenitor of the dark races, right? And he goes on to say Canaan, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, right? I think I'm missing one more, Cush, I think, but not the Negroes, right? It specifically says not the Negroes, right? The Negroes do not belong to Ham, right? And then you go, and I read the chronological history of the Russian, the chronology and chronological history of the Russian and Median Wars, where it was talking about the Great Deluge, which was the flood of Noah. And it was talking about the bloodlines. And it was talking about who belonged to Japhet being the eldest brother. And it was talking about his bloodline and the races that come from the bloodline of Japhet. And in that discussion, in that book, not discussion, in that book, it clearly stated the races of people that belong to Japhet's bloodline, right? And one of those nations, you got Gog, Magog, Tarshish, Javan, and Kittim, right? These are the descendants of Japhet, right? One of the descendants of Gomer or Magog is Ashkenaz, where we know that Ashkenaz is the Ashkenazi Jew, which makes up 89% of the Jewish population, right? And so then you have other races that is listed in this chronological book, such as the Armenians, the Dravidians, Hindustan. It talks about the Siberians, right? Anybody that's related to Genghis Khan and Attila the Han. If I'm saying that right, they are all said to belong to the bloodline of Japhet. Right, so they have the Hindu in there. They have the Turkish people in there. They have a lot of Hindu, Arabic, some Asian, and a lot of Slavic, pale skin, so-called white people races, all in the bloodline of Japhet. And so that. And the Dravidians, right? I forgot the Dravidians because there's dark-skinned folk too, right? That belong to Japhet as well, because at one point, everybody did have a brownish hue of complexion, right? Since everybody can all universally agree, allegedly, that we all have an African ancestry, which is absurd because everybody doesn't belong to the bloodline of Ham, right? But if we can all universally agree that somebody in our bloodline at one point have brown skin, then there's a universal consensus that at one point everybody in the world from different races, if you will, or different nations had brown skin, right? Okay, so let's stay on the same page. So with that being said, when I read about this chronological book and it's giving you all the nations of Japhet, never once did it tell you that Negroes were a part of Japhet, right? And where do Negroes belong? Because there are several. According to a Benjamin Franklin book concerning mankind, if you're going to say Negro, which means black, right? Or black man, black person, or just means black, right? If you're going to say what Negro, well, what kind of Negro are we talking, right? Because we know that there are various kinds of Negro. And so when we're referring to that, when we're referring to people as black, well, that's not a nation. Who do they belong to, right? So we already established that the Negroes, due to Zondervan, right? The Negroes don't belong to Ham, right? So we're not Hamites. We're not Canaanites. So we're not Hittites, Jebusites, Ammonites. We're not, we're not Moabites, right? That is the bloodline of Lot, right? We're not Hittites or Jebusites. Those belong to Ham, right? And so we now see that we are not of Gentile, right? We're not Japhet. We're not listed in any of those locations. That is in the chronology and chronological history of the Russian and Median War. We don't belong to that, right? And then if we go into current day Hindustan, we see children of the Hindustan race that clearly is said to belong to Japhet, right? Is said to belong to Japhet, right? And then we see in the Hamites, and it lets you know that in Zondervan, who belongs to Ham. Even in the chronological history of the Russian and Median Wars, it also lets you know who belongs to Ham: Ethiopia, Libya, Canaan, Cush. The sons is Mizraim, Phut, but I hope I said all of them. Ethiopia, Egypt, right? Those belong to Ham, but there's a problem because nobody knows where the Negro belongs. We clearly see that he's not of the bloodline of Japhet, and Zondervan says that he's not the bloodline of Ham. There's only a brother left, and that's Shem, just by doing process of elimination. Now, I want us to get into critical thinking. During the time of the Spanish Inquisition, many Hebrew Israelites were exiled out of Portugal and Spain to Africa. Then for many years, they were dwelling in Africa, right? Then from Portugal and Spain, they were exiled out of Africa. They were exiled to Africa, and then out of Africa to the Americas, right? And we go and we come into the America, and it's historically proven that we had Portuguese, Spanish, brown-skinned people in America, some Sephardic Jews in America. We as well, and it's documented. Brown-skinned Hebrews, or Jews, if you will. And so this is documented. This is also documented in several books about the Spanish Inquisition, describing these Hebrews being a brown-skinned, kinky-haired people, right? With, wearing bonnets and different things that they practice that would signify that they are the Hebrew people. And then just think about the American Indian slave trade, which did occur, not the African slave trade. That was all fictitious. If anybody knows that, go do the research. You can find this information out about that. I don't want to go into details because I lose my mind easily. So just staying on topic, the American Indian slave trade did take place when the Spanish and Portuguese exiles came into America, and they began to enslave a lot of the indigenous inhabitants. Some of the things that happened to the indigenous inhabitants were that in America, who are notable through James Adair, I believe, am I saying that right, to have common practice like some of the Hebrews, though some American Indian tribes were into idolatry. Now, when the Spanish and the Portuguese came in and they began to enslave the American Indian using a Bible or whatnot or whatever, they not only did they enslave them, but they shipped them coast to coast and worldwide. And just as it's said in Deuteronomy, oftentimes we're talking about Deuteronomy and we're talking about Africa, when in fact it was not. It was in the Americas where there were American Indians. Like, look what happened to Pocahontas, where she was taken out of the Americas and they took her over there in Europe or whatnot. And several tribes, like some tribes in America, I don't know if it's the Algonquin tribe, I don't want to lie, but there were some tribes taken out of America and shipped to Cape Verde and Sierra Leone, right? And that's how some of these towns were founded, with the Aboriginal inhabitants of America. They were shipped out of the Americas and shipped to different coastal lines, right? And that was the American Indian slave trade, as well as the Spanish Inquisition, some of the Spanish and Portuguese, and a lot of the Europeans who were exiled and forced out of in Europe and forced out of Europe. And many of them fled to the Americas, right? And you call them pilgrims. Pilgrims are spoken about even in the Hebrew text. They talk about pilgrims coming back to the land of milk and honey. These were brown-skinned folk. So when you ask who we American black people are, with different scriptures, not just Deuteronomy, but even the book of Maccabees, when it talks about when Jerusalem was trodden down by the Gentiles, and they went to lament, they went to mourn, and they opened up their law books, and the Gentiles had painted the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the Hebrew of the law book in the Gentiles' likeness, where they had turned every Moses and everybody, they had turned them in their likeness. They had made them white. They had gave them pale skin and beak type of noses and made them Hindu and Arabic and all these different things, despite the fact that if you go to the tablets and the carvings of on Mesopotamia, you go to Egypt and you see these pyramids, and you go into Mexico and you see these pyramids, you see these people being a brown-skinned people. The Hebrews that are on the walls working as servants under Pharaoh were brown-skinned people, right? And so you go on all these walls and these tablets and you see that. How did the Hebrews that are clearly on these tablets as black as night, brown-skinned people, turn into Slavic white folk? And on the walls of the pyramids, you see where there are Slavic white people that exist. On the walls of the pyramids, you see different dark skin and brown skin, different people, and some of the Egyptians coming in various shades of brown. And how can you deny, after seeing these written in stone features and written in stone pictures of Hebrews being brown skinned people, how, and knowing the Spanish Inquisition and knowing the history of the Dark Ages and knowing the American Indian history and knowing these histories, how can we not come to the conclusion that the American Indian is the so-called, the Hebrew is the Hebrew, the Israelites, or some of the Israelites are in fact the American black folk? And there's so much evidence to substantiate this finding to its insane. And so that's just me giving my own little rundown on the topic. But anyway, this is Kendra with Truest TV, y'all. Like, share, and subscribe. Stay up, stay blessed. Put God first above all else. Peace out. Bye.